The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
No general in history ever faced as complex or momentous a military assignment. Eisenhower was the Allied commander of all European forces, overseeing an invasion of Europe against Hitler's toughest defenses. In June 1944, it was Eisenhower who gave the official order that launched the war.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the Great Crusade. You will bring about the destruction of the German war machine. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained. He will fight savagely. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
It was the largest amphibious assault in history, involving 250,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen. And Hitler's Atlantic Wall was breached.
The Allied force, which invaded Europe on June 6, 1944, has utterly defeated the Germans by land, sea, and air.
When he returned home after the war, the public response to Eisenhower was overwhelming. He was a hero who seemed to exactly fit his times. A humble, honest, clean-cut kind of man the country just felt good about.
I am not the hero. I am the symbol of the heroic men you people and all the United States have sent to war.
No general we have had, except possibly Andrew Jackson, had as much popularity as Ike did. He exuded friendliness, interest, goodwill. But he was also a person of considerable inner reserve, a man of prodigious temper, a more complicated and less friendly fellow than he seemed to be. I think you have a very complex personality under that very attractive exterior.
Like most people, I am a man of considerable temper. But I learned long ago, many years ago, that the one thing that is damaging to anybody that aspires to a position of leadership of any kind, he must learn to control his temper.
Nicknamed Little Ike as a boy, he had learned to suppress his anger at West Point, and as a career military man, he believed what Grant had believed, that war and politics don't mix. Now, after World War II, and at the height of his popularity, Eisenhower refused to let his name be entered for the 1948 presidential campaign. It wasn't until 4 years later that his supporters finally convinced him to run.
I accept your summons. I will lead this crusade.
I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president. You like I like I. Everybody likes I for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take I to Washington. We got to camp where we are going.
The first campaign, of course, was quite an adventure. It was something completely strange in the life of the soldier.
Unlike Grant, Eisenhower proved to be a skilled politician. He threw himself into the presidential race as if it were an Allied invasion. And when he vowed to personally end Truman's war in Korea, Eisenhower easily won the election.
When I came to the presidency, the country was rather in an unhappy state. I tried to create an atmosphere of greater serenity and mutual confidence. You go through 3.5 years of active warfare, and with something can happen every minute. It's a thing that you have to learn to live with. And I had to, in a different way, learn the same lesson in the White House.
Ike gave the country a real sense of trust in the 1950s. As the first president to have press conferences filmed for television, it didn't matter that he was inarticulate, often mixing up his words. It was all part of his charm.
I'm going to try to be just as truthful as I can be. And I believe this. I think even people who wouldn't classify themselves probably as my political enemies do believe I'm honest. They may call me stupid, but I think they pick up on it.
At cabinet meetings, Eisenhower rarely spoke. While others gave reports, the president listened and doodled. His presidential style was the antithesis of that of his predecessor, Harry Truman. Ike instituted layer upon layer of executive bureaucracy. It was all part of his military-style reorganization of the White House.
Mr. Truman used to sit at his desk and tap his desk for emphasis and say, Eisenhower, he'll sit here and he'll say, do this, do that, and nothing will happen. Poor Ike won't be a bit like the Army.
But while Eisenhower may have appeared out of touch, in fact, he secretly stayed involved in every important decision. It would later become known as his hidden hand presidency. He stabilized the economy, expanded Social Security, accelerated the space program, and supported federal school and highway programs.
One of the things about the presidency is the way you have to be prepared to jump just like a mountain sheep from one jag to another jag, and you're always on the alert. You have to be.
Eisenhower ended the fighting in Korea and strengthened NATO, developing a reputation over time as a man of peace. He believed that personal diplomacy was the best way to diffuse foreign crises. Traveling the world aboard the brand new presidential jet, Air Force One, he called what he did waging peace.
If you're keeping peace, if you are, in other words, keeping a war from breaking out, that is waging peace.
Increasingly sensitive to the danger of nuclear war, Ike proposed that the United States and the Soviet Union open their respective airspace and share their nuclear stockpiles. And he invited Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to Washington and convinced him to join him at a summit in Paris to discuss a ban of all nuclear testing. It was the first major step towards diffusing the high level of nuclear tensions in the world.
All presidents since nuclear weapons came on the scene have been edgy, nervous, worried, sick about engaging military forces. Ike was always in a position where, if necessary, he could let his military judgment override that of his military advisors. And in each of the tests, which might have led to hostilities, which came along during his administration, Ike came down on the side of holding off or exercising care in a fashion which kept him personally out of political trouble.
Eisenhower's caution as president was at least in part self-serving. Throughout his presidency, he skillfully avoided political issues that could tarnish his heroic image. In the controversial area of defense, he soft-pedaled his convictions on disarmament. He cut military spending, yet he preached a philosophy of peace through strength and secretly approved U-2 spy missions to photograph Russian missile sites. It wasn't until he was wrongly accused of allowing the U.S. to fall behind the Soviets in missile production that the public saw for itself the harsher side of Eisenhower's complex personality.
If anybody believes that I have deliberately misled the American people, I'd like to tell him to his face what I think about him. This is a charge that I think is despicable, and I get tired of saying that defense is to be made an excuse for wasting dollars. I don't believe we should pay 1 cent for defense more than we have to. But I do say this, our defense is not only strong, it is awesome.
Although Eisenhower publicly criticized America's nuclear buildup, it was largely just talk. He stood by as the country's nuclear arsenal grew from 1,000 warheads to 18,000. And he persisted in activities that potentially could undermine his peace efforts with the Soviets. Just 1 week before the Paris Peace Summit, he approved one last U-2 reconnaissance flight into Russian airspace.
I was sure that sooner or later we're going to have a U-2, we're going to have this whole thing discovered. But the information we were getting was so valuable that I continued.
During that last mission, the U-2 plane was shot down by the Soviets. At first, Eisenhower denied knowledge of the spying mission, then finally admitted that it was he who had authorized it. At the Paris Peace Summit, an angry Nikita Khrushchev ridiculed Ike's reputation for honesty, then stormed out. Eisenhower was devastated. His final opportunity to leave a lasting legacy of disarmament had failed.
Looking back on 8 years, you say, well, now, what did we get done? You have to recognize the political conditions under which they were done.
Ike was very good at issues of peace and war when he could deal with them without involving public commitments of his own prestige, his own popularity, his own approval. Much more hesitant when it came to that.
Ike's was an extraordinary presidency as he presided over an extended era of peace and prosperity. But by the time he bid farewell to his country, even he recognized that he had allowed nuclear proliferation to spin dangerously out of control.
Disarmament is a continuing imperative. I confess that I lay down on my official responsibilities in this field with a definite sense of disappointment. As one who has witnessed the horror and the lingering sadness of war, as one who knows that another war could utterly destroy this civilization, I wish I could say tonight that a lasting peace is in sight. Now, on Friday noon, I am to become a private citizen. I am proud to do so. I look forward to it. Thank you, and good night.
In many ways, he was the embodiment of the American dream. The small-town boy who rose to heroism and then brought both grace and dignity to the highest office in the land. But unlike Washington, who in the end was willing to risk his popularity for his principles, Eisenhower was not. For while he genuinely wanted a more peaceful world, he was unwilling to put his reputation on the line on behalf of disarmament.
I have no doubt he could have been elected for a third term had he chosen to run and had the Republicans not made the great mistake of passing a constitutional amendment which forbade him to do so. I remain immensely popular to this dying day. But I am rendered nervous by the concept of the hero, the general, the man who represents honor and duty, not the grubby exchanges of politics. He steps off his pedestal and becomes president. Yet I have to admit that on the occasions that we've indulged ourselves in heroes from outside, we have not done too badly.
America has turned to war heroes for more than a third of its presidents. And military men who reach the high office most often have acted with military restraint. Still, Americans retain a measure of skepticism about soldier presidents. And in time of crisis and impending war, the country usually elects civilians and not generals. But America itself was born in war, and her first, and many say greatest president, was himself a general. And so at regular intervals, we return to our origins, raising to high leadership the military hero.
They built a nation on values.
So I want you to keep in mind when Eisenhower invited Nikita Khrushchev to the United States, Khrushchev invited Eisenhower to visit the Soviet Union the following year. And what they didn't mention in this film was that at the time of the U-2 spy plane was shot down, and the Paris Peace Accords broke down, Eisenhower was disinvited from that trip to the Soviet Union. So it was supposed to be this big peace conference that would be kind of a crowning achievement of his presidency, and then this tour of the Soviet Union, and it was supposed to show, how we were coming to an agreement, and it all fell apart. So it was really devastating for the president, and which he had hoped would be this, big part of his legacy. So that was really too bad. All right. Hope if I plug it in. So I think we ended somewhere around the French losing Vietnam when their fort at Dien Bien Phu collapsed. They were unable to hold it, and they were forced to surrender. The Geneva Conference led to an agreement known as the Geneva Accord. The Geneva Accords in 1954 divided Vietnam into two at the 17th parallel. North of that, it would be a communist state. South of that would be a democratically elected state. And the United States did not sign the Geneva Accords, so keep that in mind, because President Eisenhower was worried about allowing the Vietnamese people to have a referendum to vote on the type of government that they wanted. He was afraid that the communists would win the election. And remember, American foreign policy during the Cold War is all based on the Truman Doctrine's idea of the policy of containment to stop communism in its tracks, not let it spread anywhere, even in a small, poor, third world nation like Vietnam. All that money the United States had been sending to the French military now is being directed to help the new government in South Vietnam. And the United States would have more and more a bigger footprint in Vietnam over the course of about the next 20 years now. We would continue to send more military advisors in the 1950s and early 60s and special forces until eventually, of course, full-scale war would break out. Although technically it was not a war, but we'll get to that. 1954 is also the year that the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization was created. And it would officially go into effect in 1955 and exist for only just over 20 years, from 1955 to 1977. The Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, similar to the military alliance like NATO is, but similar but different. It's different because in NATO, an attack on one is an attack on, all, right? And in CETO, an attack on one was not necessarily an attack on all. It was not necessarily a call that you would go immediately to defend a member nation. It was something that would have to be decided upon. But what it does is it opens a door to allow for both American intervention in Vietnam, perhaps at some later date, more significant intervention, or other member nations' intervention. So eventually in the 1960s and 70s, of course, you do see some of these nations sending troops to fight in Vietnam, such as Australia and New Zealand. What leads to a escalation in fighting in Vietnam is actually what occurs in the summer of 1964. The USS Maddox was on a spying mission. It was actually in North Vietnamese waters, although at the time it was said that they were in international waters. Only later did we find out, years later, that they weren't. They were actually attacked by a North Vietnamese torpedo boat, and then 2 days later, the Maddox and the Sea Turner Joy, another destroyer, were supposedly attacked, although that has been debunked in recent years, and it's believed that it's due to a heavy storm and misreadings of the radar, and there was no attack. But nevertheless, this led to Congress actually issuing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution only 5 days later, and only 3 days after the supposed second attack. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution essentially says Congress, at least in regards to the situation in Vietnam, gives the president the power essentially to create war, to deal with the situation as he believed necessary. Essentially, President Johnson now could send troops and weapons to South Vietnam to fight the communists in the north. It was up to his discretion. So that's why it's not technically a war. It's actually a military action in which the president decided to send troops, and not a declaration of war, which can only be made by Congress. In 1964, though, Vietnam's really not on the American public's radar. Certainly the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution did make the papers and the news, but the president doesn't take any significant action. That escalation would not come until 1965, after the presidential election. 64 is a presidential election year, Of course, President Kennedy by this time has been assassinated. Vice President Johnson now became president. He runs for election in his own right as president in this election. So right now, everybody is thinking about the presidential election. It's only after the election that President Johnson then makes the decision to send large numbers, hundreds of thousands of troops to Vietnam. If you're interested in the history of Vietnam, you can take an entire course on it. Has anybody taken that course yet? No, it's Professor Meyerowitz teaches it. And Professor Meyerowitz actually fought in Vietnam as well. So he's not only a historian, but he has personal, first-hand knowledge of being there during this time. So anyway, I just want to preface this by saying, we only spend a tiny little bit of time on this huge war. But anyway, there's obviously many, many things that you can talk about. Agent Orange is one of the lingering effects of the Vietnam War, both for our veterans as well as for the people who live in Vietnam. It is a chemical defoliant, actually just one of many horrible chemicals that were used to chemically burn the foliage off the jungle in Vietnam as a way to expose the enemy, and so our bombers could see better what they were bombing, also to try to force our enemy to come out and fight, because this is really a war that was a guerrilla war in which the enemy was hidden in the jungle, and it's not like a traditional war like, say, even World War II, where armies fought against each other on a battlefield. And Agent Orange is poisoning people in Vietnam even to this day, and of course poisoned many of our soldiers, and many died from it. So this is actually a news report that was done about 3 years ago by the New York Times about Agent Orange, what happened back in the 1960s and 70s using this chemical, and the effects of it in recent decades.
Is this the same one?
Oh, we saw this.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, then we don't have to see it. Thank you for letting me know that. So, did we see the Tet Offensive? Did we get there? Should have told me. I had already talked about that. The American public was quite supportive of the war in Vietnam, but there comes a major change that will be a tipping point in which many Americans begin to doubt our ability to win, and the reason why we're even there. And that all begins in January of 1968. So the Tet Offensive, Tet is the New Year, the Vietnamese New Year, and there was supposed to be a truce, but the North Vietnamese actually attacked 36 of the 44 provincial capitals in South Vietnam, and it led to the American public really questioning our ability to win the war. It showed how vulnerable our sites, South Vietnam was, and how vulnerable our troops were. The North Vietnamese were actually even able to penetrate the American compound of the American embassy. Well, they didn't get into the embassy building itself. They did manage to get into one of the houses in the building. So it was a psychological and political victory that the communists had, even though it was a military defeat. And of course, in the end, they did win because, well, the American public begins to doubt what's going on. They begin to doubt our military leaders, because of course on TV plays a big part of this war. People are now in the 1960s, TVs are pretty much in every single household. People are watching the news in the evening, and there were embedded reporters, what we would call embedded reporters, who were broadcasting from the from various places throughout Vietnam, films showing military actions, and the public had been always told that we're winning. General Westmoreland, who was in charge at the time, said was always talking about how we were winning, but in fact, that's not necessarily the case. I have to just switch. We didn't see any video on TET. Okay, yeah, this video doesn't work. That's the problem. I don't think it works. Yeah. Hang on. Okay. Sorry about that. The link wasn't working. There you go. Hang on, we don't want to watch commercials. It's almost there. Huh.
This year, we'll be taking a look back. We start in Vietnam with the Tet Offensive, which began 50 years ago this coming Wednesday. David Martin has the story of Americans under fire in the frontline city of Hue.
The 26-day battle for Hue was fought street by street, house by house, room by room. 216 American troops were killed and another 1,300 wounded.
Many people are hurting real bad right now. We lost 2nd platoon, they were wiped out, and part of 1st platoon. They lost a lot of people.
10,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had seized Hue at the outset of the Tet Offensive.
Then you see there's one little tin roof sticking out.
And the Marines were sent in to claw it back.
If there's anything close to hell, it had to be Hue.
That's the voice of Sergeant Bob Thomas, wounded 6 times, but still alive today.
In this photo, he's leading an assault on a tower the enemy was using to shoot down on American troops. The night before, he had joined his Marines in prayer.
Everybody held hands. This was our prayer. God, we know we're about to see you in person. If we've got to die on this tower, let us die like men and Marines, and don't embarrass ourselves, our families, or the Marine Corps. Amen.
One of the images in this exhibit are the first 12 men that went up the tower. And within 30 seconds, 5 of them were critically injured.
John Olson, then a 20-year-old Army photographer, took these extraordinary photos, including this sequence. A wounded Marine is in agony. Wrapped in a blanket, he whispers the Lord's Prayer as his life slips away, and another wounded Marine stands guard. Later, a chaplain administers last rites.
It was a totally new combat experience for all these men. They'd never been in house-to-house fighting before.
Olson's photos are now on exhibit at the museum in Washington, D.C. to mark the 50th anniversary of the Tet Offensive.
If you had to choose the most important event of the Vietnam War, it certainly would be the Tet Offensive. It changed how people looked at the war. In doing so, it changed the war itself.
Walter Cronkite, America's most trusted newsman, went to Hue, the longest and bloodiest battle of Tet,
having to undergo heavy small arms and mortar fire as they turned,
and came back to tell the public the war could not be won.
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
Nothing delivered that message more vividly than Olson's photo of wounded Marines being carried out of Hue on a tank.
What I see when I look at that photo today are 7, 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, badly wounded. It's painful to look at.
The shirtless figure is an 18-year-old Marine shot through the chest, a symbol of American innocence shredded by the reality of Vietnam.
I remember it well.
His name is A.B. Grantham, and he is now 68 years old, having come as close to death as it is possible to come.
It was what we call a sucking chest wound. Hit the breastbone, went through the right side, and exited under my shoulder blade.
Was it painful?
Very much, and very hot.
How did they stop the bleeding?
The bleeding wasn't the main problem to begin with. It was the breathing. I couldn't breathe because I had a hole in my chest.
How close did you come?
I don't think it could have got any closer. They had zipped me up into a body bag. And I remember somebody saying, "This one's not dead yet." And lo and behold, they got me out and I made it.
None of the Marines on the tank were identified, and that was fine with Grantham, who didn't want people to know he had been to hell and back.
Tried to hide back into society and just fade away, and be like everybody else and have a nice, normal life. But it didn't last. The war has a way of rearing its ugly head from time to time. Once you learn something, it's hard to unlearn it.
And what did you learn?
I learned that humanity can be very cruel to each other.
Grantham was diagnosed with severe and chronic PTSD. For 29 of the past 50 years, he has been in therapy and doesn't go anywhere without his service dog, Bo.
There was a lot of memories, a lot of nightmares, a lot of resentment to what had happened to us and what we were put through.
The Vietnam War still rears its ugly head, but Grantham is hiding no longer.
Dr. Katz, this guy saved my life.
50 years after Tet, the Marine on the tank says it's time to see that war more clearly.
I'm hoping that the public can embrace the war now, and they can learn exactly what happened and what went on, and that we had many, many, many heroes that didn't come back with us from over there alive.
So
to be the ones.
It's pretty. It's a lot. It's nice to be able to hear, though, from people who fought, and of course, the attitude has changed now. I think I mentioned the other day how these servicemen were not appreciated for what they did at the time, which was a tragedy. I don't know why that keeps coming up. So, well, there were all kinds of horrible, horrible things that occurred in this war. One of the great tragedies was when an entire village, mostly women and children, were killed, and that was known as the Miley Massacre. That occurred on March 16, 1968. There's a lot of footage out there about this, photographs, but it's all too graphic. So, but I want you to be aware of it. This was a war where you really didn't know who your enemy was, where people who were working in the camps during the day for our servicemen at night may have been attacking the camps.
How do you pronounce it again?
Miley. So we heard that President Nixon, or did we hear? Maybe we didn't hear that yet. I was thinking we heard it in one of the clips that I showed, but we might not have. President Nixon decided to implement this idea of Vietnamization, in which we would draw down our soldiers on the ground and in favor of training more South Vietnamese soldiers. There was certainly a lot of concern that the South Vietnamese were not doing enough to defend their own country. And of course they had us. But anyway, this idea was would of course lead to more soldiers being brought home. But what the public wasn't told that when this policy of Vietnamization was implemented, that then the president was determined to use more pressure, more bombings, and eventually it led to an escalation of the war instead of what many thought was going to be a bringing of an end to hostilities. And eventually there's even bombings in Cambodia, so extending the war to bases where there were North Vietnamese camps. So that led to a new wave of protests. Certainly students here in this country in the late 60s and early 1970s were involved in the student protest movement, which began in the early 60s, just relating to changes on campus, morphed into protests against the war. And there were secret bombings of Cambodia that I mentioned in the spring of 1970 that led to more of these protests. And so let's go back first to this film. This is a number of veterans talking about their experience and talking about Vietnamization. Hopefully it will work okay. History Channel is always a little slow. It should work. I got to work yesterday. Yeah. I mentioned something about the Wi-Fi service yesterday, and apparently there have been some big problems lately. So it's not just what's going on here; it's apparently going on across campus.
When I went on campus, the sign would come up saying that they were doing maintenance.
Oh, yeah, I get that a lot. A lot of times you can still go in there and do stuff. And
yeah, I still got in.
Yeah. It's just been especially slow lately, the internet. Try to refresh it and see what happens.
Is it possible that every person in Michigan
when General Westmoreland took over, his strategy was basically to search and destroy. In other words, to search out the communists, the Viet Cong, as well as the North Vietnamese that would come into the country, and to destroy them. And the measure of success for that was the body count. It's a terrible way to try to prove success in war. The theory behind this strategy was that we would eventually wipe out enough of them that they would no longer continue sending forces into Vietnam.
The idea was to go out and destroy the infrastructure of the communist, quote, forces. If we went in an area and decided that there was too much rice, we would say, oh, well, this area is obviously supporting the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. We would either destroy it or send it to friendly areas.
Search the living quarters, search the animal areas, search anything that was available there for you to look into.
If we found weapons, we would take people. If we found draft age men, we would stick them on helicopters and fly them to an area where they would be interrogated.
If the family was in there, of course, protecting them, moving them out the way. It was certainly not everything you see just burn it, destroy it, kill the people. It was not the case. That happened one time. But you was alert.
This went all the way up until the Tet Offensive in 1968. What that did was that proved that the North was going to pay any price and send any number of troops down there in order to run us out of South Vietnam. People then decided that the strategy that General Westmoreland was using was not the appropriate strategy, and that's when they brought in General Abrams. And his strategy was Vietnamization. In other words, train the Vietnamese forces so that they could take over the war.
Remember, President Nixon wanted to end the war, but then he finds himself in the same predicament that President Johnson found himself in, that he didn't want to be the first president to lose a war. So that's the problem that President Nixon had. President Johnson made a statement once saying that he felt like a man in a hailstorm, that he couldn't run, he couldn't hide, and he couldn't make it stop. Those secret bombings of Cambodia then, that were then part of this plan when Vietnamization, training more troops but relying on more bombing, led to these protests, and one of them turned deadly at Kent State University in Ohio. Student protesters burned down the ROTC building. The National Guard was called out, and they fired shots into a crowd of protesters who were unarmed, and killing 4 students and injuring others.
Don't like it when your man takes off his ring?
This is actually a news report from the time.
Tear gas first started down the Commons, then the guard moved up on both sides of Taylor Hall and forced the kids off the Commons. Then one group, I don't know how many there were, 50 maybe, perhaps more, perhaps less, moved down into the practice football field.
After you beat them, no matter what you do, will you ask them to leave? They've got grievances, they've got demands, the demands on both sides, we have to talk.
And then there were a whole lot of kids around them. A few kids were throwing sticks and stones, but that was only a handful, not more than 10, 15. And then the guard shot some tear gas up on the hill to disperse the crowd, and the kids picked it up and threw it back.
Make a perimeter, a circle, right out in here. From the right, yep, go around, a big circle around here. You don't talk during a state of emergency, Mike, you know that. Come on. Sorry, we'll talk as soon as we get this settled down. Who knows people? They're sitting quiet. Okay, will you ask them to leave? This area immediately. Leave this area immediately.
And all of a sudden I heard the shooting. And then I saw people dropping to the ground, and then I fell to the ground also, because I couldn't walk anymore.
What the investigators have to determine then is whether indeed there was a sniper and whether the guard was justified in firing his weapons, or whether, as some people here believe, the guard, under the pressure of a rock-throwing attack, panicked and fired its weapons indiscriminately, killing 4 people. Mike Pappas, CBS News, at Kent, Ohio.
Okay. By the time of the Kent State Massacre, President Nixon had issued or essentially changed American policy relating to the policy of containment, and it's known as the Nixon Doctrine. So while the policy of containment is still in place, especially relating to, say, Europe, it's not something that he's telling our allies in Southeast Asia to rely upon. So those CETO members, that we are not going to fight communism at all costs in Southeast Asia, and they're going to have to rely on themselves in the future if communism does spread, because the Vietnam War had been so devastating in the 1960s. You go from a period in the early 60s where there's a government surplus, and to the late 1960s where the government's greatly in debt from the huge costs that were incurred fighting this war. Our allies in Europe really couldn't understand what we were doing. They thought, why were we spending this enormous sums of money, huge loss of life for our soldiers, as well as killing so many civilians in Vietnam, and really what was the purpose, and really did it matter that, why were we there? It was harming national security. The country was deeply divided. So it was a very difficult time in our history. And so the Nixon doctrine is saying, the president's saying, in the future, don't expect that the United States is going to come to your aid. Now, one of the great legacies, certainly of President Nixon's time in the White House, because of course the shadow of Watergate and his resignation always lingers, but it's a time of lessening of tensions in the Cold War between the United States, Russia, and Communist China. And so that's certainly positive. You see the SALT talks were quite successful, and so there was an agreement relating to the limitation of nuclear weapons under President Nixon. And so those talks that had begun already back in the 1950s continue through the 1960s, and you start to see some real progress by the time you get to the early 70s. The situation in Vietnam, of course, had been a situation in which American presidents had been dealing with, actually going back all the way to President Roosevelt. We had some military advisors in French Indochina at the end of World War II. Future presidents would only escalate America's involvement in that part of the world. And the Pentagon Papers were these secret documents which were released by a Pentagon employee named Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg was one of several employees at the Pentagon who had been asked to write a report about Vietnam, situation in Vietnam, and in the research that they did, looking at various classified information going back several decades, showed that every administration since the 1940s had essentially lied to the American public about America's involvement in Vietnam. And this was all classified and something that nobody knew about except for a few select people who had access to these papers. And Ellsberg believed that it would be best, even though he broke the law, to, pretty gutsy. I don't know who many people would risk doing that, but he did. And he actually stole these documents and released them to various newspapers. Initially, the New York Times, and then the Washington Post. And actually, this little clip will talk about the situation. President Nixon and the Attorney General filed suit against the New York Times and then other papers trying to stop the publication. But in the end, the Pentagon Papers were published, and the court case that tried to stop it actually went all the way to the Supreme Court.
The war in Vietnam tears America apart. Anti-war activists take to the streets, and the government reacts with tear gas and bayonets. Unknown to the American public, a secret report was commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The highly classified document contains evidence of lying by the government about the reasons the war is being fought and the probability of success. In 1971, Daniel Ellsberg, one of the select group of Pentagon analysts who wrote the classified study, turns against the war.
They were prepared to prolong the war, to expand the war at each step, rather than to lose it, and Nixon was the same.
And Ellsberg had been very much supportive of the war until he began this research project as part of his job.
Want to end this war. The American people want to end this war.
Ellsberg believes that Nixon's pledge to get out of Vietnam is not to be trusted.
All I could do was to put out top secret documents of history showing every previous president acted the way I claim Nixon is acting. Read this and see if you don't think you should look very closely at what Nixon is doing. challenge him, have hearings, call witnesses, find out whether he really means to get out.
Ellsberg leaks the secret documents to the New York Times. Editors have to decide whether to publish them. It causes a heated debate within the paper.
Went on for 3 months, and all the time we were examining it, meetings took place, and they got extremely tense at some times because one or two of the editors didn't want us to print it. They felt it was not right. Nothing like this had been done. Did we have the right to do it? Did we have the right to withhold it?
The decision to make the papers public is not an easy one. Stakes are high.
Because, you know, if we were wrong and this was something that hurt a single soldier, we would live with it forever.
Sunday, June 13th, 1971. The New York Times begins its explosive series based on the Pentagon Papers.
I felt that we were doing our duty. I knew the government would have a heart attack.
The Nixon administration is outraged. They say printing classified documents in the New York Times risks national security.
We subscribe to the Bill of Rights, but they are not absolute in any circumstance.
The Attorney General orders the New York Times to stop, but the paper refuses and lands in federal court.
The United States of America comes into the courtroom for the first time in the history of our republic and asks for a temporary restraining order, restraining the nation's most preeminent newspaper, the New York Times, from further publishing material because of national security considerations. It never before happened.
The Nixon administration wins a restraining order against the New York Times. For the first time in U.S. history, a newspaper is prevented from printing a story. Now Daniel Ellsberg leaks the documents to the Washington Post. Publisher Katharine Graham faces the decision of a lifetime: to print or not to print.
She told me, look, it wasn't the most cerebral of decisions, but at the end of a minute she simply said, go ahead, publish it.
When the Washington Post is stopped from printing, a determined Daniel Ellsberg gives the documents to the Boston Globe.
Newspaper after newspaper defied the executive branch of the U.S. government, defied the president, who was telling them that for them to publish these papers on their own initiative would endanger the United States.
The case quickly advances to the Supreme Court. 9 justices will have to decide if the government has proved the publication of the Pentagon Papers is so dangerous it must be stopped. What is really at stake? Soldiers' lives or politicians' reputations? On June 30th, 1971, in a hushed and expectant courtroom, the decision is announced. It is 6-3 for the press.
I think it's reaffirmed the fact that that a free press in our country is entitled to run the way people like to run a free press, that the government can't just march in and stop us from publishing.
You saw the Attorney General there, John Mitchell. You know who eventually ends up going to jail? The Attorney General, because he had been in the head of the committee to re-elect President Nixon in 1972 and was part of the plot to break into the Democratic National Headquarters. And then he obstructed justice when there was an investigation into the role of the committee to re-elect the president in the break-ins, and he ends up being convicted, and he went to prison. Well, he's sentenced to 2.5 to 8 years, but he ends up serving only 19 months before he was released. A politician that lied. How unusual.
Yeah, but that wouldn't be the prison that me or you would go to.
So, oh no, yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, the Nixon administration, of course, will always, his legacy will always be tainted by the Watergate break-ins, and then, of course, the related cover-up. So, which we will get to Watergate later. Let's see. Okay. So I think we're a little bit ahead of everybody else, and I think we're in really good shape.
Good luck with today's lesson.